The text message from my husband arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other. "We need to talk when you get home. It's about Marcus from your office." My hands trembled as I read it again, sitting in my car in the parking lot of Meridian Financial Services. 20 minutes earlier, I had been reviewing quarterly portfolios with clients, completely unaware that my world was about to shatter. My name is Cassandra Vale, and I had no idea that my boss, Victoria Brennan, had just called my husband to tell him I was having an affair with our colleague Marcus Chen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive home felt endless. Every red light gave me more time to imagine the conversation waiting for me, more time to wonder what lies Victoria had told David. My husband and I had been married for 8 years, together for 12. We'd weathered job losses, family deaths, and the stress of buying our first home. Never once had either of us questioned the other's faithfulness. But now, thanks to whatever poison Victoria had whispered into David's ear, I was walking into my own home feeling like an accused criminal. David was waiting in the living room when I opened the front door, his usually warm brown eyes cold and distant. Our golden retriever, Honey, sensed the tension immediately and retreated to her bed in the corner. The silence stretched between us until David finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled in that way that meant he was fighting not to explode. "Victoria Brennan called me today," he said, not moving from his position on the couch. "She said she felt it was her duty as your supervisor to let me know about your relationship with Marcus Chen." The way he said Marcus's name, like it tasted bitter, made my stomach clench. She had quite a lot to say about the late nights, the private meetings, the way you two look at each other. I sank into the armchair across from him, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "David, that's not true. None of that is true." My voice sounded hollow, even to myself. "Marcus and I work together, yes, but we're not having an affair. We've never been anything more than colleagues." "She seemed pretty certain," David continued, his jaw tight. "Said she's been documenting things for weeks, the times you've stayed late when he's stayed late, the lunch meetings that go longer than they should. She even mentioned that you two went to that conference in Portland together last month." "We went with a group of 8 people from the office," I protested. "Victoria was there too. She knows it wasn't just Marcus and me." But I could see doubt flickering in David's eyes, and I realized with growing horror that Victoria's accusations weren't random. She had carefully constructed a narrative using real events twisted beyond recognition. Yes, Marcus and I had worked late on several occasions, but always on legitimate projects with other team members present. Yes, we had attended the same conference, but as part of our department's continuing education requirements. "Why would she lie?" David asked, and the question hung between us like a blade. What would she gain from destroying our marriage? I wished I had an answer. Victoria Brennan had been my supervisor for 18 months, ever since she'd been hired to restructure our investment advisory division. She was ambitious, efficient, and had a reputation for getting results. But she'd also shown an increasingly strange interest in my personal life over the past few months, asking probing questions about David's work schedule, commenting on my marriage in ways that felt invasive rather than friendly. "I don't know why she's doing this," I admitted. "But David, you know me. You know I would never cheat on you. I love you. I've never given you any reason to doubt that." For a moment, his expression softened, and I saw a flicker of the man who used to make me coffee every morning before work, who still left little notes in my lunch bag after all these years. But then he shook his head, as if pushing away his instincts in favor of the seed of doubt Victoria had planted. "I want to believe you, Cass," he said quietly, "but she was very convincing. She said she'd been struggling with whether to call me, that she'd hoped you'd end it on your own." He stood up, running his hands through his dark hair. "I need some time to think. I'm going to stay at my brother's tonight." The sound of the front door closing behind him echoed through the house like a gunshot. Honey padded over and rested her head on my lap, her warm weight the only comfort in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. I sat there in the gathering darkness, trying to understand how my life had imploded so completely in the space of a single afternoon. The next morning at work, I moved through my routine like a ghost. I reviewed client files, returned phone calls, and attended meetings, all while feeling like I was watching someone else live my life. Victoria stopped by my desk around 10, her expression a perfect mask of professional concern. "Cassandra, you look tired," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Everything all right at home?" The casual cruelty of the question nearly took my breath away. She knew exactly why I looked tired. She had orchestrated it. But looking at her perfectly composed face, her expensive suit, and carefully styled blonde hair, I realized that confronting her directly would only make me look unstable, emotional, exactly what she probably wanted. "I'm fine, thank you," I managed. "Just a busy week." She murmured, her pale blue eyes studying my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Well, if you need to talk, you know my door is always open. Sometimes personal problems can really affect our work performance, and we can't have that, can we?" After she walked away, I sat staring at my computer screen, my hands shaking with rage and helplessness. This wasn't random workplace drama. This was targeted, calculated, personal. But why? What had I done to earn Victoria's hatred? What could she possibly gain from destroying my marriage? Marcus stopped by my desk during lunch, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued. He was a good guy, married to his college sweetheart with twin toddlers at home. We'd worked together for 3 years without a single inappropriate moment between us. "Hey, Cass," he said, glancing around nervously. "Can we talk privately for a minute?" We walked to the small break room at the end of the hall, empty during the lunch hour. Marcus closed the door and turned to face me, his expression troubled. "David called me last night," he said without preamble. "He wanted to know if there was any truth to what Victoria told him." My heart sank. I'd hoped to explain the situation to Marcus myself before David's anger reached him. I told him absolutely not, that we're just colleagues, but he seemed really upset. "Victoria called David yesterday," I explained, feeling the humiliation burn in my cheeks. "She told him we were having an affair. She apparently has been documenting evidence to support her story." Marcus's face went pale. "That's insane. Why would she do that?" "I wish I knew," I said. "But Marcus, I'm so sorry you're getting dragged into this. I know how much you love Sarah and the kids. The last thing I wanted was for this crazy situation to affect your family too." "We'll figure this out," Marcus said firmly. "There has to be a reason she's targeting you like this. People don't just randomly decide to destroy someone's marriage for fun." But as the day wore on, I began to realize that maybe they did. Maybe Victoria's motivations weren't rational or understandable. Maybe she simply enjoyed the power that came with manipulating other people's lives. That evening, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at my phone. David hadn't called or texted all day. I'd tried reaching out to him twice, but both calls had gone straight to voicemail. The house felt cavernous without him, every creak and settle magnified in the silence. I was heating up leftover soup when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Emma. "David called me. What's going on? He sounded really upset." I closed my eyes, imagining David reaching out to my family, seeking confirmation or denial of Victoria's lies. Emma and I were close, and David knew she would tell him the truth if she knew it. But how could I explain a situation that made no sense even to me? I called Emma back, and she answered on the first ring. "Cass, honey, what's happening? David said something about your boss calling him about an affair?" "Emma, I need you to listen to me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I am not having an affair. I have never cheated on David. My boss, Victoria Brennan, called him yesterday and told him I was involved with a colleague named Marcus Chen. It's completely false, but she was apparently very convincing." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Why would your boss lie about something like that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "That's what's driving me crazy. I can't figure out what she gets out of this. Have you done anything that might have made her angry? Turned down a project she wanted you to take? Gotten recognition she thought she deserved?" I considered this. In the 18 months Victoria had been my supervisor, our relationship had been professional but not particularly warm. She was demanding, micromanaging, and had a tendency to take credit for her team's successes while blaming them for failures. But I couldn't think of any specific incident that would justify this level of vindictive behavior. Nothing that would warrant this, I said. Emma, David actually believes her. He's staying at Tom's place while he thinks things over. She's managed to put doubt in his mind about our entire marriage. Oh, honey, Emma said softly. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Do you want me to talk to David? I don't think that would help right now, I replied. He needs to come to his own conclusions. I just hope he remembers who I am, who we are together, and realizes that this doesn't make sense. But even as I said it, I wondered if love and logic would be enough to overcome the poison Victoria had injected into my marriage. The next few days passed in a surreal haze. David continued staying at his brother's house, our conversations limited to brief, stilted phone calls about practical matters like bills and schedules. At work, Victoria maintained her facade of professional concern while watching me with those cold blue eyes, as if she were studying the effects of her handiwork. Marcus and I avoided any unnecessary interaction, both of us acutely aware that Victoria was probably watching for any behavior she could twist into further evidence. The irony wasn't lost on me that her false accusations were actually affecting my relationship with Marcus more than any real feelings ever had. We couldn't even have normal work conversations without second-guessing how they might be interpreted. On Friday afternoon, I was reviewing a client's retirement portfolio when Victoria appeared at my desk again. She had a habit of materializing silently, and I'd started to feel constantly surveilled, as if she might pop up at any moment. Cassandra, I need to see you in my office, she said, her tone neutral, but her eyes gleaming with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Her office was on the corner of our floor, with large windows overlooking the city. Victoria had decorated it with expensive artwork and fresh flowers that were replaced twice weekly. Everything about the space screamed success and control, from the leather chairs to the mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. Please, sit, she said, settling behind her desk like a queen on her throne. I wanted to check in with you about your recent performance. I've noticed you seem distracted lately. I forced myself to meet her gaze steadily. My performance has been consistent with my usual standards. All my client reviews are up to date, and I've exceeded my quarterly targets. She murmured, opening a file folder. Perhaps we have different definitions of consistency. I've been noting some concerns. She pulled out what appeared to be a detailed log, pages of handwritten notes, extended lunch breaks, personal phone calls during work hours, and what seems to be a concerning preoccupation with your colleague Marcus Chen. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. Victoria hadn't just made up accusations about my alleged affair. She had been systematically documenting my every move, creating a paper trail to support her narrative. The dates, times, and descriptions were all accurate, but twisted beyond recognition. This note from last Tuesday, she continued, pointing to an entry, shows that you and Marcus had a private conversation in the break room for approximately 15 minutes. The door was closed. Can you explain what was so important that it required privacy? We were discussing a client project, I said, though I knew how weak it sounded. The truth was, that had been the conversation where Marcus told me about David's phone call, but I couldn't say that without confirming her story. And this one, from the previous week, Victoria went on, flipping a page, you stayed late 3 nights in a row, the same 3 nights Marcus worked late. Quite a coincidence. Each entry was like a small stab wound, all the more painful because they were based on real events taken completely out of context.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Victoria had been watching me, tracking me, building her case with the patience and attention to detail of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Victoria, I said, my voice carefully controlled, what exactly are you implying? She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I'm not implying anything, Cassandra. I'm simply noting patterns of behavior that concern me as your supervisor. Of course, as I told your husband, I hope my concerns are unfounded. The casual mention of David was like a slap across the face. She wanted me to know that this was personal, that she had deliberately reached out to destroy my marriage. But she was doing it with such calculated precision that I couldn't accuse her of harassment without sounding paranoid. Is there anything else? I asked, standing up. Just remember that Meridian Financial has very high standards for professional conduct, she said, her smile never wavering. We can't afford to have our clients' confidence shaken by inappropriate relationships between staff members. I walked back to my desk on unsteady legs, Victoria's words echoing in my mind. She wasn't just trying to destroy my marriage. She was building a case to fire me, using her fabricated affair story as grounds for termination. But why? What could she possibly gain from ruining my life so completely? That evening, I sat in my home office, staring at my computer screen but seeing nothing. Honey was curled up at my feet, her presence a small comfort in the growing darkness of my situation. I pulled up Victoria's employee profile on our company intranet, looking for clues about her background, her motivations, anything that might explain her behavior. Victoria Elizabeth Brennan, 38 years old, MBA from Northwestern, previously worked at 3 different financial firms before joining Meridian. Her professional accomplishments were impressive, but there was something about the timeline that nagged at me. She'd left her previous position at Hartwell & Associates rather abruptly, with only 2 months between jobs. I opened a new browser tab and started searching for information about Victoria's time at Hartwell & Associates. What I found made my stomach drop. A Business Journal article from 8 months ago mentioned a restructuring at the firm following concerns about management practices in their advisory division. The article was vague, but it mentioned that several key employees had left the company during the transition. I kept digging, following threads through professional networking sites and industry publications. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of Victoria's pattern of behavior. At each of her previous jobs, there had been unexplained departures, restructurings, and whispered complaints about a toxic work environment. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a forum post on a professional women's networking site. A woman named Jennifer Walsh had posted a warning about a supervisor who had systematically undermined female colleagues through careful documentation of imagined improprieties. The post was from 2 years ago, and while it didn't mention Victoria by name, the details were chillingly familiar. She would watch us constantly, the post read, noting every conversation, every interaction with male colleagues. Then she would twist these observations into evidence of unprofessional behavior. She destroyed 2 marriages that I know of and got 3 women fired before anyone realized what was happening. My hands were shaping as I screenshot the post. This wasn't about me specifically. This was Victoria's pattern, her method of operation. She was a predator who targeted successful women and systematically destroyed their careers and personal lives. But knowing this didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made the situation more terrifying. If Victoria was as skilled at this as Jennifer's post suggested, how could I possibly fight back? I was still at my computer at midnight when my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and my heart leaped with hope. "Hi," I said softly. "Cass, I'm sorry to call so late." David's voice was strained, exhausted. "I've been thinking about everything, and I don't know what to believe anymore." "David, please come home," I said. "We can talk about this together. I can show you what I've been finding out about Victoria." "What do you mean?" I quickly explained what I'd discovered about Victoria's history, the pattern of behavior, the forum post from Jennifer Walsh. David listened in silence, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That's a pretty convenient discovery," he said finally, and my heart sank. "You're saying your boss is some kind of serial workplace predator, and you just happened to figure this out right when you need to prove your innocence? David, you know me," I pleaded. "You know I wouldn't make something like this up." "I thought I knew you wouldn't cheat on me either," he replied quietly. "But Victoria showed me things, Cass. Photos from that conference in Portland, timestamps showing when you left work the same time as Marcus, receipts from restaurants where apparently you two had private lunches. My mind reeled. Photos? Receipts? Victoria's documentation was even more extensive than I'd realized. She hadn't just been taking notes, she'd been conducting full surveillance. Photos of what? I asked. David, I told you, I was never alone with Marcus at that conference. We were always with the group. There's one of you two walking together, just the two of you, near the hotel elevators, David said. The timestamp shows it was taken at 11 p.m. I thought back to the conference, trying to remember. Then it hit me. David, I remember that night. Marcus's key card wasn't working, and I walked with him to the front desk to get a new one. The whole thing took maybe 5 minutes. Someone from our group was probably in the elevator when the photo was taken. That's what you said about all the other evidence, too, David replied. There's always an explanation, always a reason why things aren't what they seem. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of Victoria's carefully constructed web. She hadn't just made accusations, she had built an entire false reality, complete with photographic evidence and documentation that would convince anyone who wasn't looking for the truth behind the manipulation. What do you need from me? I asked desperately. What would it take for you to believe me? David was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know, Cass. I really don't know. After he hung up, I sat in the dark living room with Honey, both of us staring out the window at the empty street. Victoria had won. She had successfully convinced my husband that I was having an affair, and she had the documentation to prove it. Worse, she was probably already preparing to fire me, claiming that my inappropriate relationship with Marcus was affecting my work performance. But as I sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. The despair began to transform into anger, and then into determination. Victoria might be skilled at manipulation and gaslighting, but she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated me. If Victoria wanted to play games with documentation and evidence, I would play along, but I would play to win. And unlike her, I wouldn't have to manufacture my proof. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The office building was nearly empty, just a few security guards and maintenance staff. I made my way to my desk and began to carefully examine my workspace, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It didn't take long to find the first camera. Hidden in the decorative plant on the filing cabinet next to my desk was a tiny wireless camera, no bigger than a button. My skin crawled as I realized Victoria had been watching me, not just during our conversations, but constantly. Every phone call, every email, every moment of my workday had been recorded. I forced myself not to react, knowing that any sudden movement would alert Victoria to my discovery. Instead, I continued my normal morning routine while mentally cataloging what I'd found. If there was one camera, there were probably others. Over the next hour, as more employees arrived and the office came to life, I discreetly searched for additional surveillance equipment. I found 2 more cameras, one positioned to capture the area around Marcus's desk, and another focused on the break room where Marcus and I had had our private conversation. Victoria hadn't just been documenting my behavior through observation. She had been conducting illegal surveillance, recording me without my knowledge or consent. The photos David had mentioned, the timestamps, the detailed logs of my activities, all of it had been gathered through hidden cameras that violated both company policy and state law. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a surge of hope. Victoria might be manipulative and calculating, but she had crossed a line that even her carefully constructed narrative couldn't justify. No legitimate concern about employee conduct would require secret surveillance equipment. I spent my lunch hour researching surveillance laws in our state. What I found made my heart race with excitement. Recording someone without their consent in a workplace setting was a felony, punishable by significant fines and potential jail time. The evidence Victoria had gathered through her illegal surveillance couldn't be used against me, and the act of gathering it was itself a serious crime. But I needed to be careful about how I handled this discovery. If I confronted Victoria directly, she would simply deny everything and remove the cameras. If I reported it to building security or our HR department, she might claim the cameras were for legitimate security purposes. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. My friend Rachel worked as a private investigator, specializing in corporate fraud cases. We'd met in college and stayed close over the years, and I trusted her judgment completely. When I called her that afternoon, explaining the situation in carefully neutral terms, she agreed to meet me after work. We sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop downtown, away from my office and anywhere Victoria might see us. Rachel listened intently as I explained everything: the false accusations, David's reaction, the surveillance equipment I'd discovered, and the pattern of behavior I'd uncovered in Victoria's employment history. "This is serious, Cass," Rachel said when I finished. "What you're describing is workplace harassment at minimum, possibly criminal stalking. The illegal surveillance definitely crosses into felony territory." "But how do I prove it without alerting her to what I know?" I asked. Rachel smiled grimly, very carefully. "We need to document everything she's done while gathering evidence that can't be dismissed or destroyed. The cameras are perfect for that, but we need to handle this properly to make sure the evidence is admissible if this goes to court." Court? The word made my stomach lurch. "Cass, this woman has systematically destroyed your marriage and is working to end your career through illegal surveillance and false accusations. If we don't stop her, she'll do it to someone else. From what you've told me about her employment history, she probably already has." Rachel pulled out a notebook and began sketching out a plan. We would need to carefully document the locations of the surveillance equipment, gather information about Victoria's previous victims, and most importantly, catch her in the act of using the illegally obtained recordings. "The key is getting her to admit what she's doing," Rachel explained. "If we can record her acknowledging the surveillance or threatening to use the recordings against you, we'll have everything we need." It was a risky plan, but it was the only path I could see toward clearing my name and stopping Victoria from destroying anyone else's life. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: hope. But I also felt the weight of what I was about to undertake. Fighting back against Victoria wouldn't just require courage, it would require me to become someone I'd never been before: calculating, strategic, and willing to take significant risks for the chance at justice. The woman who had meekly accepted false accusations and begged her husband to believe her was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to hunt them back. Victoria Brennan had chosen the wrong target. She was about to discover that some stones don't just withstand the current, they redirect it entirely. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one writing the rules. The following Monday morning, I walked into Meridian Financial with a small recording device Rachel had given me tucked inside my blazer pocket. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. I would confront Victoria about her surveillance, hoping to get her to admit what she'd been doing while the recording captured every word. Rachel had coached me on what to say, how to phrase questions that would encourage Victoria to reveal her methods without realizing she was incriminating herself. But as I sat at my desk, watching Victoria move through the office with her usual air of authority, my hands trembled slightly. One wrong word, one suspicious gesture, and she could destroy whatever remained of my career and reputation. The morning dragged by with excruciating slowness. I completed my routine tasks while hyper-aware of the tiny cameras watching my every move. Now that I knew where they were, I felt their presence like a physical weight. Every time I glanced toward the plant on my filing cabinet, I imagined Victoria somewhere else in the building, watching me through the feed. Around 11, I noticed Marcus looking unusually agitated. He kept checking his phone and glancing nervously toward Victoria's office. When our eyes met across the office space, he gave me a subtle nod toward the break room. My heart sank, wondering what new crisis Victoria had manufactured. In the break room, Marcus closed the door and turned to face me with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Cass, we have a problem. Sarah got a call this morning." My blood turned to ice. "What kind of call?" "Someone claiming to be from Human Resources at Meridian," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "They told her there had been reports of inappropriate conduct between employees, and they needed to verify some information about my work schedule and travel arrangements." I leaned against the counter, feeling sick. Victoria wasn't content to destroy just my marriage. She was expanding her campaign to include Marcus's family, using official-sounding contacts to legitimize her lies. "Did Sarah believe it?" I asked. "She's confused and upset," Marcus replied. "She asked me about the Portland conference, about why I've been staying late at work, about you specifically." He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. I told her the truth, but now she's questioning everything. She wants to know why someone from HR would be asking these questions if there wasn't some substance to the concerns. The devious brilliance of Victoria's strategy became clear. By impersonating an HR representative, she had given her accusations an official weight that made them harder to dismiss. Sarah wasn't just dealing with workplace gossip anymore. She was dealing with what appeared to be a formal company investigation. "Marcus, I'm so sorry," I said, meaning it deeply. "I never wanted your family to get dragged into this insanity." "It's not your fault," he said firmly, "but we need to figure out how to stop this before it gets worse. Sarah is already talking about me finding a new job just to avoid any appearance of impropriety." That was exactly what Victoria wanted, I realized. She didn't just want to destroy relationships. She wanted to drive out anyone she perceived as a threat or obstacle. Marcus was a talented financial advisor with strong client relationships. His departure would create opportunities for Victoria to restructure the department according to her preferences. "I think I might have a way to expose what she's doing," I said carefully, glancing around the break room. "But I need you to trust me and not ask too many questions right now." Marcus studied my face intently. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing yet. Just continue being professional and documenting any contact Victoria has with you or anyone claiming to represent the company. If anyone else calls Sarah, get their name and department and tell her to ask for written confirmation of any investigation." That afternoon, I sent Victoria an email requesting a private meeting to discuss my performance review. My hands shook as I typed, knowing that this conversation would determine whether I could gather the evidence needed to expose her, or whether she would succeed in destroying my career entirely. Victoria responded within an hour, suggesting we meet in her office at 4:30. The timing was perfect. Most of the office would be winding down for the day, giving us privacy for what I hoped would be a revealing conversation. I spent the remaining hours rehearsing my approach. Rachel had emphasized the importance of staying calm and letting Victoria do most of the talking. People who enjoyed manipulating others often couldn't resist explaining their methods when they felt secure in their power. At 4:25, I knocked on Victoria's office door, the recording device activated and hidden in my pocket. She called for me to enter, and I found her seated behind her imposing desk, looking as polished and controlled as always. "Cassandra, please sit," she said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "I understand you wanted to discuss your performance review." "Actually," I said, settling into the chair and meeting her gaze directly, "I wanted to discuss the documentation you've been keeping about me, the notes about my interactions with Marcus, the timeline of my work schedule, all of it." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, a flash of surprise that she quickly masked. "I document any behavior that might impact our department's performance. It's part of my job as a supervisor." "Is photographing employees part of your job too?" I asked, watching her face carefully. Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment, her confident smile faltering. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "The photos you showed my husband, the ones with timestamps from the Portland conference." I kept my voice level, professional. "I'm curious about how you obtained those images." "Your husband mentioned our conversation," Victoria said slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "I felt it was my duty to share my concerns with him, given the impact your behavior could have on your work performance." "Your concerns based on surveillance footage?" I pressed. Victoria leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely rattled. "Surveillance is a strong word, Cassandra. I simply pay attention to what happens in my department." "With cameras?" I asked directly. The silence stretched between us for several long seconds. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied my face, clearly trying to determine how much I knew and whether I was bluffing. "I think you're under a great deal of stress," she said finally. "The situation with your marriage, the questions about your professional conduct, it's obviously affecting your judgment. Perhaps you should consider taking some time off." But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the wheels turning as she reassessed the situation. She hadn't denied the cameras, she'd deflected and changed the subject. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to be useful. "Victoria," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I know about Jennifer Walsh." The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly that for a moment I thought she might actually faint. The name hit her like a physical blow, confirming what I'd suspected about her past behavior. "I don't know what you think you know," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "But I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "I'm not making accusations," I replied calmly. "I'm simply noting patterns of behavior, documentation of employee activities, concerns about inappropriate relationships, the systematic destruction of professional reputations. It's interesting how these situations seem to follow you from job to job." Victoria stood up abruptly, moving to the window and staring out at the city skyline. When she turned back to face me, her mask of professional composure had completely slipped. What I saw in her eyes was pure rage, barely contained, and all the more frightening for its intensity. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I've built my career by identifying problems and solving them efficiently. Employees who can't maintain appropriate professional boundaries are problems." "Problems that require secret surveillance to document?" I asked. "I do whatever is necessary to protect this company's reputation," Victoria snapped. "If that means keeping a closer eye on employees whose behavior raises red flags, then that's what I do. The cameras simply ensure that I have accurate information when concerns arise." There it was, the admission I needed, captured on the recorder hidden in my pocket. Victoria had not only acknowledged the surveillance, but had framed it as a legitimate business practice. She had no idea she'd just confessed to multiple felonies. "And calling employees spouses?" I continued, pushing for more. "Is that also standard practice for protecting the company's reputation?" Victoria's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Sometimes concerned supervisors have to make difficult decisions about how to handle sensitive information. When an employee's personal life threatens to create a scandal that could damage client relationships, it becomes necessary to take preventive action." "Preventive action? Like fabricating evidence of affairs that don't exist?" "I've never fabricated anything," Victoria said, her voice sharp. "I simply observe, document, and draw reasonable conclusions from the patterns I see. If those conclusions happen to reveal uncomfortable truths about an employee's conduct, that's not my fault." The recording device was capturing every word, but I needed to be careful not to push too hard. Victoria was clearly unstable, and cornered predators often became desperate and dangerous. "I think I understand now," I said, standing up slowly. "Thank you for clarifying your approach to supervision." Victoria studied my face suspiciously, clearly trying to determine whether my calm acceptance was genuine or strategic. "I hope this conversation has helped you understand the seriousness of your situation, Cassandra. Professional conduct matters here at Meridian, and employees who can't meet our standards typically don't last long." "I'll certainly keep that in mind," I replied, moving toward the door. "Oh, and Cassandra?" Victoria called after me. "I'd be very careful about making any wild accusations or claims about surveillance. People might start to question your mental stability, especially given the stress you're clearly under." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Victoria was warning me that any attempt to expose her would be met with attacks on my credibility and sanity. I left her office and walked calmly back to my desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and triumph. The recording device had captured everything: Victoria's admission about the cameras, her justification for calling David, her barely veiled threats about my future employment. It was more than enough evidence to expose her methods and protect myself from her continued harassment. But as I gathered my things to leave for the day, I noticed Victoria watching me from her office doorway. Her expression was thoughtful, calculating, and I realized that our conversation had raised her suspicions about how much I knew. The direct questioning about cameras and surveillance had been necessary to get her confession, but it had also put her on guard. I needed to move quickly before she had time to remove the surveillance equipment or develop new strategies to discredit me. The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Victoria was warning me that any attempt to expose her would be met with attacks on my credibility and sanity. I left her office and walked calmly back to my desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and triumph. The recording device had captured everything: Victoria's admission about the cameras, her justification for calling David, her barely veiled threats about my future employment. It was more than enough evidence to expose her methods and protect myself from her continued harassment. But as I gathered my things to leave for the day, I noticed Victoria watching me from her office doorway. Her expression was thoughtful, calculating, and I realized that our conversation had raised her suspicions about how much I knew. The direct questioning about cameras and surveillance had been necessary to get her confession, but it had also put her on guard. I needed to move quickly before she had time to remove the surveillance equipment or develop new strategies to discredit me. That evening, I met Rachel at her office downtown. She had converted an old warehouse space into a modern investigation firm, complete with secure meeting rooms and state-of-the-art equipment for analyzing evidence. "Let's hear what you got," Rachel said, connecting the recording device to her computer system. We listened to the entire conversation in silence, Rachel taking notes as Victoria's voice filled the room. When the recording ended, Rachel sat back in her chair with a satisfied smile. "This is gold, Cass." She admitted to illegal surveillance, acknowledged targeting employees' personal relationships, and threatened retaliation. Any decent prosecutor would have a field day with this. "But is it enough to stop her?" I asked. "Victoria is smart. She'll find a way to spin this or claim she was speaking hypothetically." "Maybe," Rachel agreed. "But this recording, combined with the physical evidence of the cameras and the pattern of behavior from her previous jobs, builds a compelling case. The question is whether you want to take this to the police, file a civil lawsuit, or handle it through your company's internal processes." I considered the options. Going to the police would certainly expose Victoria's criminal behavior, but it might take months to build a case, during which time she could continue to harass me and other employees. A civil lawsuit would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. But handling it internally through Meridian's corporate structure might allow Victoria to manipulate the narrative and escape consequences. "What if we did all three?" I suggested. "File a police report to establish the criminal nature of her behavior, threaten a civil lawsuit to get the company's attention, and present everything to Meridian's board of directors as evidence that they have a serious liability problem." Rachel nodded approvingly. "That's a comprehensive approach. It puts pressure on Victoria from multiple directions and forces the company to take action to protect themselves from legal exposure." "But first, I want to gather more evidence," I said. "The surveillance equipment is still in place, which means she's continuing to commit crimes every day. If we can document the ongoing illegal activity, it strengthens our case significantly." Rachel pulled up a calendar on her computer. "How long do you think you can maintain the pretense that you don't know about the cameras?" "Not long," I admitted. "Victoria is suspicious after today's conversation. She's going to be watching me even more closely, looking for signs that I'm planning something." "Then we move fast," Rachel decided. "Tomorrow, I'll start documenting the camera locations and gathering evidence about Victoria's employment history. You focus on staying normal at work while we prepare to expose everything." As I drove home that night, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The wheels were in motion to stop Victoria's harassment, but I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. People who built their careers on manipulation and control rarely surrendered their power willingly. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Can we talk tomorrow? I've been thinking about everything you said." For the first time in days, I felt a flutter of hope about my marriage. Maybe the evidence of Victoria's pattern of behavior was finally helping David see the truth about her accusations. Maybe there was a chance to save not just my career, but my relationship with the man I loved. But I also knew that Victoria's most dangerous moves often came when she felt cornered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and I needed to be prepared for whatever desperate measures she might take to protect herself. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I arrived at work to find Marcus's desk empty, his personal belongings gone. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as I realized Victoria had moved faster than I'd anticipated. I approached Sandra, one of the administrative assistants, who was organizing files near Marcus's former workspace. "Where's Marcus?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Sandra glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. "He was let go yesterday afternoon. Voluntary resignation, according to the official notice, but everyone knows it wasn't really voluntary." My heart sank.
Victoria had eliminated one of her primary targets, probably using the threat of escalating harassment against his family to force his departure. It was a strategic move that removed a potential witness to her behavior while sending a clear message about what happened to people who crossed her. Did he say anything before he left? Just that he hoped things would work out for everyone, Sandra replied, but he looked really upset. Whatever happened in that meeting with Victoria, it wasn't pleasant. I spent the morning trying to focus on my work while processing this new development. Marcus's forced resignation proved that Victoria was willing to destroy innocent people to protect her position. It also meant that I was now her primary target, without the buffer of a colleague who could corroborate her harassment.
Around noon, I received an email from Victoria requesting another meeting. The subject line read, "Performance Improvement Plan Discussion," and my stomach dropped. Performance improvement plans were typically the first step in building a case for termination. Victoria was moving to eliminate me, just as she had eliminated Marcus. But this time, I was ready for her. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Victoria's office. I arrived precisely on time, the recording device once again hidden in my pocket. Victoria sat behind her desk with a thick folder open in front of her, filled with what appeared to be performance documentation. "Cassandra, thank you for coming," she said with false friendliness. "I wanted to discuss some concerns about your recent work performance and outline a plan for improvement." "What specific concerns?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Victoria opened the folder and began reading from what was clearly a prepared script. Over the past month, I've documented several instances of decreased productivity, missed deadlines, and inappropriate personal interactions during work hours. There have also been reports of unprofessional conduct that could damage our client relationships. Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound legitimate while being impossible to definitively disprove. Decreased productivity could be subjective. Missed deadlines could be blamed on personal distractions. Unprofessional conduct was vague enough to encompass almost anything. "Can you provide specific examples of these missed deadlines?" I asked. Victoria flipped through several pages, citing dates and projects that I knew I had completed on time, but she was banking on the fact that proving the accuracy of deadlines weeks after the fact would be difficult without access to the detailed project management systems. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "the ongoing disruption caused by your personal situation is affecting team morale and productivity. Several colleagues have expressed concerns about the work environment." This was the masterpiece of her manipulation, using my own team members as evidence against me, claiming that my presence was somehow damaging to people who had actually been supportive. It was a lie that would be almost impossible to refute without forcing my colleagues to take sides publicly. "What kind of performance improvement are you suggesting?" I asked, knowing that any plan Victoria proposed would be designed to set me up for failure. "A 60-day improvement period with weekly check-ins, specific productivity targets, and restrictions on personal interactions during work hours," Victoria read from her notes. "Failure to meet these requirements would result in immediate termination." The plan was a trap. The productivity targets would be set impossibly high. The restrictions on personal interactions would be subjectively enforced, and the weekly check-ins would give Victoria multiple opportunities to document failures. It was designed to create a paper trail justifying my termination while appearing to give me a fair chance to improve. "And if I don't agree to this plan?" I asked. Victoria's smile was cold and predatory. "Then we would have to consider whether your current attitude and performance are compatible with Meridian standards. Sometimes it's better for everyone when employees find opportunities that are a better fit for their skills and professional goals." It was a barely veiled threat of immediate termination if I didn't submit to her rigged improvement plan. Either way, Victoria was engineering my departure from the company. "I'll need some time to consider this," I said. "Of course," Victoria replied, "but I'll need your decision by tomorrow morning. These performance issues can't continue to impact our department's effectiveness." As I left her office, I felt the walls closing in around me. Victoria had moved much faster than I'd anticipated, implementing her final strategy to eliminate me before I could expose her illegal surveillance. But she had also made a crucial mistake. The performance improvement plan she'd outlined was clearly retaliatory.
implemented immediately after I'd confronted her about her surveillance activities. The timing would be obvious to any investigator, establishing a clear connection between my questions about her illegal behavior and her sudden concerns about my work performance. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Rachel. We met at a 24-hour diner across town, away from any location where Victoria might spot us. "She's moving to fire me," I explained, describing the performance improvement plan meeting. "I have until tomorrow morning to agree to her terms or face immediate termination." Rachel listened intently, taking notes as I spoke. When I finished, she sat back and considered the situation. "This actually works in our favor," she said finally. "The timing makes it obvious that this is retaliation for your questioning her surveillance. No reasonable person would believe that your performance suddenly became a problem the day after you confronted her about illegal cameras." "But if she fires me tomorrow, how does that help?" I asked. "Because wrongful termination lawsuits are easier to prove than harassment cases," Rachel explained. "If we can show that you were fired in retaliation for discovering illegal surveillance, any jury would side with you." "That's assuming I can afford to fight a wrongful termination lawsuit," I pointed out. "Victoria knows I can't match the company's legal resources." Rachel smiled grimly. "That's where things get interesting. I spent today researching Victoria's employment history more thoroughly. What I found suggests that Meridian Financial might be very interested in settling this quickly and quietly." She pulled out a file folder containing printouts of news articles, court documents, and corporate filings. Victoria's previous employer, Hartwell & Associates, paid out 3 separate wrongful termination settlements in the 6 months before she left, Rachel explained. The amounts were sealed, but the pattern suggests they were dealing with a serious liability problem in their management structure. "You think Victoria was the problem?" "I think Victoria has been the problem everywhere she's worked," Rachel replied. "And I think Meridian's executives have no idea what kind of legal liability they've inherited by hiring her." Rachel spread out copies of several documents on the diner table. "Look at this pattern. Every company Victoria has worked for that's had unexplained departures of female employees, settlements related to workplace harassment, and restructuring of departments after she left." The evidence was damning. Victoria wasn't just a manipulative supervisor. She was a pattern predator who had been moving from company to company, leaving a trail of destroyed careers and legal settlements in her wake. "So, what's our play?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to accept Victoria's performance improvement plan," Rachel said. "But you're also going to request a meeting with Meridian's board of directors to discuss concerns about management practices in your department. Won't that just give Victoria more ammunition against me?" "Not if we present it properly," Rachel explained. "You're not making accusations against Victoria specifically. You're raising concerns about potential legal liability that the board needs to know about. You're being a responsible employee who's trying to protect the company from expensive lawsuits." Rachel pulled out a draft letter she'd prepared. This requests a meeting to discuss patterns of employee turnover, potential surveillance issues, and the risk of wrongful termination lawsuits. It's written in corporate language that focuses on protecting the company rather than attacking Victoria. I read through the letter, impressed by how it presented my concerns as business issues rather than personal grievances. It mentioned the surveillance equipment without accusing Victoria directly, referenced the pattern without naming specific individuals, and emphasized the legal and financial risks to the company. "Will the board actually meet with me?" I asked. "They'll have to," Rachel said. "Once you've formally raised concerns about illegal surveillance and wrongful termination in writing, they have a legal obligation to investigate. If they ignore your complaint and something bad happens later, they could be held liable for knowing about problems and failing to act." The plan was risky, but it was the only path I could see toward exposing Victoria's behavior while protecting myself from retaliation. By framing my complaint as a business concern rather than a personal grievance, I might be able to get the board's attention before Victoria could spin the narrative in her favor. "There's one more thing," Rachel added. "I want to document the surveillance equipment before Victoria has a chance to remove it. If we can get photographs of the cameras in place, along with technical analysis of their capabilities, it strengthens your credibility significantly." "How do we do that without alerting her?" Rachel smiled.
Leave that to me. I have some specialized equipment that can detect and photograph hidden surveillance devices without triggering any alerts. If you can get me access to your office after hours, I can document everything Victoria has installed. As we finalized the plan, I felt a mixture of determination and terror. Tomorrow would determine whether I could expose Victoria's illegal behavior or whether she would succeed in destroying my career entirely. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like I was taking control of the situation rather than simply reacting to Victoria's attacks. The predator was about to discover that her latest target had claws of her own. Walking into Meridian Financial the next morning felt like entering a battlefield where only I knew the war had begun. I had accepted Victoria's performance improvement plan in writing, sent my letter requesting a board meeting to the corporate offices, and arranged for Rachel to document the surveillance equipment that evening. Everything depended on timing and execution. If Victoria suspected what I was planning, she could remove the cameras, destroy evidence, and claim that my accusations were the desperate fantasies of an employee facing performance issues. But as I sat at my desk, going through the motions of my normal work routine, I felt a calm determination that surprised me. For weeks, I had been reacting to Victoria's manipulation, scrambling to defend myself against accusations I couldn't disprove. Now, finally, I was taking offensive action. Victoria appeared at my desk around 10, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp with suspicion. "I trust you've had time to review the performance improvement plan," she said. "I have," I replied, handing her the signed agreement. "I'm committed to meeting all the requirements you've outlined." Victoria studied the document, clearly looking for any hint of resistance or defiance. Finding none, she seemed almost disappointed. "Excellent," she said finally. "We'll schedule our first weekly check-in for Friday. I trust you understand the importance of demonstrating immediate improvement." "Absolutely," I replied with false enthusiasm. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns." After Victoria walked away, I spent the rest of the morning documenting my current projects and productivity levels. If she planned to claim that my performance was declining, I wanted detailed records showing the opposite. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can we meet tonight? I want to talk about everything." My heart leapt with hope and anxiety. David's message suggested he was ready to have a real conversation about Victoria's accusations, but I couldn't predict whether he was prepared to believe my version of events or whether he had decided our marriage was beyond repair. I texted back, "Yes, dinner at home? I'll cook." His response came quickly, "That sounds perfect. I miss you." Those 3 simple words gave me more strength than any legal strategy or surveillance evidence could. David missed me. Despite Victoria's poison, despite the doubts she had planted, some part of him still loved and missed his wife. The afternoon passed slowly as I waited for evening to arrive. At 5:30, I left Meridian Financial and drove home to prepare dinner, knowing that Rachel would be arriving at the office building shortly to document Victoria's surveillance equipment. David arrived at 6, looking tired but more like himself than he had since this ordeal began. Honey greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, tail wagging frantically as if she understood that his return might signal the end of our separation. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals over 8 years of marriage, and faced each other across a gulf that Victoria had created. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," David began, "about everything Victoria told me, about your explanations, about what I know to be true about you as a person." I waited, afraid to speak and break whatever spell was allowing him to consider my innocence. "The thing is," David continued, "Victoria's story makes sense logically. She had evidence, documentation, specific details about times and places, but emotionally, it doesn't feel right. You're not secretive, Cass. You've never been good at hiding things from me, even surprise parties." A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth despite the seriousness of the conversation. "So I started asking myself why your boss would lie about something like this," David said. "What would she gain from destroying our marriage?" And I realized I didn't have a good answer to that question. I took a careful breath. "David, I've discovered some things about Victoria that I think you need to know."
Over the next hour, I told him everything. The surveillance equipment I'd found, the pattern of behavior from her previous jobs, the forum post from Jennifer Walsh, and the recording I'd made of Victoria's confession. David listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "She's been watching you with hidden cameras?" he asked when I finished. "Multiple cameras," I confirmed. "That's how she got the photos and timestamps she showed you. She's been conducting illegal surveillance for weeks, maybe months." David sat back in his chair, processing everything I'd told him. "Cass, if this is true, what she's done isn't just wrong, it's criminal." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm fighting back. Not just for me, but for Marcus, for the women at her previous jobs, for anyone else she might target in the future." David reached across the table and took my hand, the first physical contact we'd had since Victoria's poison had driven him away. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he said quietly. "I should have trusted what I knew about you instead of letting a stranger convince me you were someone else." Tears burned my eyes as I squeezed his hand. "You couldn't have known what she was capable of. She's been doing this for years, perfecting her methods." "What happens now?" David asked. "Tomorrow, Meridian's board of directors will receive my formal complaint about illegal surveillance and management misconduct," I explained. "Rachel is documenting the surveillance equipment tonight. By the end of the week, Victoria's crimes will be exposed." David nodded grimly.
"And if the company tries to cover it up or retaliate against you? Then we'll take everything to the police and the media," I said. "Victoria's pattern of behavior speaks for itself. Eventually, the truth will come out." That night, David and I sat together on our couch with honey between us, feeling like we were finally on the same side again. My phone buzzed with updates from Rachel as she documented the surveillance equipment, confirming what I'd suspected about the extent of Victoria's spying. The hidden cameras were more sophisticated than I'd realized, capable of recording both video and audio with enough clarity to capture private conversations and personal details. The violation felt even more profound, knowing how much of my life Victoria had been monitoring without my knowledge. But with each piece of evidence Rachel documented, I felt stronger and more vindicated. Victoria had been so confident in her power, so certain that her victims would never fight back, that she'd left a trail of criminal evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away. As David and I prepared for bed, he paused in the doorway of our bedroom. "Whatever happens with your job, we'll get through this together," he said. "I won't let her destroy our marriage." For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep feeling like I had a partner in this fight rather than facing Victoria's manipulation alone. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the end for Victoria Brennan's reign of terror, and I was ready for whatever desperate measures she might take when cornered. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and this time, I held all the evidence needed to ensure justice would finally be served. The call came at 7:30 the next morning while David and I were having coffee. Rachel's voice was tight with excitement as she delivered the news that would change everything. "The surveillance equipment is even more extensive than we thought," she said, without preamble. "I found cameras in the break room, near Marcus's old desk, and 3 separate angles covering your workspace. But here's the really interesting part. I also found audio recording devices in the conference rooms." My blood ran cold. Audio devices? High-end equipment that could pick up private conversations, phone calls, even whispered discussions. Cass, she's been recording confidential client meetings, privileged attorney-client communications when lawyers visit, everything. This isn't just workplace harassment anymore. This is corporate espionage. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been targeting individual employees, she'd been gathering intelligence that could destroy the entire company. Client confidentiality was the foundation of financial services. If it became known that private meetings had been secretly recorded, Meridian would lose every major account within weeks. "Did you document everything?" I asked. "Photos, technical specifications, serial numbers, the works," Rachel confirmed. "I also found the central recording server hidden in a supply closet on the executive floor. She's been storing months of footage and audio files." David squeezed my hand as I processed this information. Victoria's crimes went far beyond what I'd imagined.
She hadn't just been manipulating individual careers, she'd been building a comprehensive surveillance network that violated federal privacy laws and could expose Meridian to millions of dollars in lawsuits. Rachel, this changes our entire strategy, I said. We're not just dealing with workplace harassment anymore. This is criminal surveillance on a massive scale. Exactly, Rachel agreed, which means Meridian's board will have to act immediately to protect the company. They can't afford to ignore this or try to cover it up. I arrived at work that morning with a sense of grim anticipation. Rachel's evidence was already being delivered to the board of directors, the FBI's white-collar crime division, and Meridian's legal department. By noon, Victoria's secret surveillance network would be exposed to everyone who mattered. But Victoria seemed unusually agitated as she moved through the office. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the elevators, and making brief, hushed phone calls. Something had spooked her, and I wondered if she'd somehow discovered that her surveillance equipment had been compromised. Around 10:30, two men in expensive suits emerged from the elevator and walked directly to Victoria's office. Through the glass walls, I could see Victoria's face go pale as they showed her their credentials. FBI agents, I realized. Rachel had moved faster than I'd expected. The conversation in Victoria's office lasted exactly 12 minutes. When the agents left, Victoria remained seated behind her desk, staring at nothing. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely afraid. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Chen, Meridian's chief executive officer. Ms. Vale, this is Robert Chen. I need you in my office immediately. Please bring any documentation you have regarding surveillance activities in your department. The executive floor felt different than the rest of the building, all polished marble and mahogany paneling that screamed corporate power. Robert Chen's office was twice the size of Victoria's, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. Chen was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of corporate leadership. But today, he looked like someone who'd just discovered a bomb in his basement. Ms. Vale, please sit, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. I've just received some very disturbing information about activities in your department. Yes, sir, I replied carefully. The SBI has informed us that illegal surveillance equipment was discovered throughout our offices, Chen continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. Equipment that was apparently installed and operated by your supervisor, Victoria Brennan. I nodded, saying nothing. Chen was clearly struggling to process the magnitude of the situation. They've also provided us with recordings of Ms. Brennan admitting to conducting unauthorized surveillance of employees, Chen said. Recordings that you apparently made during a private conversation. That's correct, I confirmed. Chen leaned back in his chair, studying my face intently. Ms. Vale, I need you to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. If client meetings were recorded without consent, if privileged communications were compromised, this company could face lawsuits that would destroy us completely. I understand, sir. The FBI is treating this as a federal crime, Chen continued. Corporate espionage, violation of privacy laws, potential securities fraud if any recorded information was used for trading purposes. He paused, running his hands through his hair. In 30 years of corporate leadership, I've never seen anything like this. Chen pulled out a thick file folder and opened it on his desk. I've been reviewing Ms. Brennan's employment history. It appears she left her previous positions under circumstances that are now looking much more suspicious. I discovered some of that information myself, I said carefully.
There seems to be a pattern of employee departures and legal settlements wherever she's worked. A pattern we completely missed during our hiring process, Chen admitted grimly. Ms. Vale, I want you to know that Meridian Financial takes full responsibility for this situation. We hired someone who turned our workplace into a surveillance state, and we failed to protect our employees from her illegal activities. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Chen wasn't just concerned about legal liability, he was genuinely horrified by what Victoria had done. What happens now? I asked. Ms. Brennan has been terminated effective immediately, Chen said. Security is escorting her from the building as we speak. The FBI has seized all surveillance equipment as evidence, and we're implementing a complete review of our hiring and supervision practices to ensure this never happens again. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I felt lightheaded.
Victoria was gone. Her surveillance network was dismantled. The nightmare was finally over. Additionally, Chen continued, we're prepared to offer you compensation for the harassment you endured, full support for any legal action you choose to pursue against Ms. Brennan personally, and a promotion to department manager with a significant salary increase. The offer was generous, more than I dared to hope for, but there was something else I needed to address. Mr. Chen, I appreciate the offer, but I need to know what's being done for the other employees who were affected. Marcus Chen was forced to resign because of Victoria's harassment. Other people may have suffered similar treatment. Chen nodded approvingly. We're conducting a full review of every termination and resignation that occurred during Ms. Brennan's tenure. Mr. Chen has already been contacted and offered his position back with full back pay. Anyone who can demonstrate they were harmed by Ms. Brennan's actions will receive appropriate compensation. And what about the clients whose meetings were recorded? That's a more complicated situation, Chen admitted. We're working with our legal team and the FBI to determine exactly what was recorded and whether any confidential information was compromised. Every affected client will be notified and offered whatever remediation is appropriate. As I left Chen's office, I felt like I was walking on air. Victoria's reign of terror was over, not just for me, but for everyone she might have targeted in the future. The surveillance equipment was gone, the recordings were in federal hands, and Victoria herself was facing serious criminal charges. But the most satisfying moment came when I reached my floor and saw Victoria being escorted toward the elevators by 2 security guards. She was carrying a small cardboard box containing her personal belongings, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. When our eyes met across the office space, I saw something I'd never expected to see in Victoria's expression: defeat. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked like what she really was beneath all the manipulation and control: a small, petty person whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. The next few weeks brought a series of revelations that painted an even more disturbing picture of Victoria's activities. The FBI's analysis of her surveillance network revealed months of illegal recordings, including confidential client meetings, private employee conversations, and even phone calls between attorneys and their clients. Victoria had been building a comprehensive intelligence operation that went far beyond workplace harassment. She'd been gathering information that could be used for blackmail, insider trading, or corporate espionage. The recordings included everything from merger discussions to personal family problems, creating a database of secrets that could have destroyed countless lives and careers. The legal consequences for Victoria were swift and severe. Federal prosecutors charged her with multiple counts of illegal surveillance, violation of privacy laws, and wire fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, including her own recorded confession and the physical surveillance equipment found throughout the building. But perhaps more satisfying than the criminal charges were the civil lawsuits that began piling up. Jennifer Walsh, the woman whose forum post had first alerted me to Victoria's pattern of behavior, filed suit for damages related to her previous harassment. 3 other women from Victoria's former employers came forward with similar stories and legal actions. Marcus returned to work with a formal apology from the company and a promotion that recognized his years of dedicated service. The false accusations that had driven him away were publicly retracted and his reputation was fully restored. David and I spent the settlement money from Meridian on a long overdue vacation to Europe, finally taking the honeymoon trip we'd postponed 8 years earlier due to work obligations. Walking through the streets of Paris, sharing wine at sidewalk cafes, and simply enjoying each other's company without the shadow of Victoria's manipulation, I felt like I was rediscovering what happiness meant. 6 months after Victoria's arrest, I received a call from a reporter working on an investigative piece about workplace surveillance and employee harassment. She'd tracked down 5 other women who had been targeted by Victoria's systematic campaign of destruction across 3 different companies. The pattern was always the same: identify successful female employees who might threaten Victoria's position, implement surveillance to gather compromising information, fabricate evidence of inappropriate conduct, and then either force them out or destroy their careers through false accusations. But in every previous case, the victims had been isolated, fighting alone against a supervisor who had the backing of corporate management. They'd had no way to prove the surveillance, no evidence of the manipulation, no support system to help them fight back. I had been different only because I'd figured out what Victoria was doing before she could complete her destruction, and because I'd had Rachel's expertise to help me gather evidence. Without those advantages, I would have ended up just like Victoria's previous victims, unemployed, discredited, and with no way to prove what had really happened. The reporter's article, when it was published, sparked a national conversation about workplace surveillance and the need for stronger protections against predatory managers. Victoria's case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked supervisory power and the importance of listening to employees who report harassment. Victoria herself pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges rather than face trial. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to her victims. Her career in corporate management was over, her reputation destroyed, and her methods exposed for the world to see. But for me, the most meaningful victory wasn't Victoria's imprisonment or the financial settlement. It was the knowledge that her pattern of destruction had finally been broken. No more women would have their marriages destroyed by her false accusations. No more careers would be ended by her manipulative surveillance. No more families would be torn apart by her calculated cruelty. On the anniversary of the day Victoria had called David with her lies about an affair, David and I returned to the restaurant where we'd had our first date 12 years earlier. As we sat across from each other, older and wiser, but still very much in love, I reflected on how much we'd both learned about trust, communication, and the importance of believing in each other even when outside forces tried to drive us apart. Victoria had tried to destroy our marriage by exploiting the small doubts and insecurities that exist in any long-term relationship. She'd been skilled at finding those pressure points and applying just enough force to create cracks that could spread into complete breaks. But she'd underestimated the foundation that David and I had built together over more than a decade. When the initial shock of her accusations wore off, when the careful manipulation began to unravel, what remained was the simple truth of who we were to each other, partners who had chosen to build a life together and who were worth fighting for. As we walked home that evening, David took my hand and smiled. "No more secrets, no more surveillance, no more wondering if someone is watching us," he said. "Just us." "Just us," I agreed, squeezing his hand tightly. Victoria Brennan had taught me that predators often succeed because their victims feel isolated and powerless. But she'd also taught me that even the most sophisticated manipulation can be defeated when you refuse to accept the role of victim and instead choose to fight back with truth, evidence, and the support of people who believe in you. Some battles are worth fighting, not just for yourself, but for everyone who might face the same predator in the future. Victory tastes sweetest when it protects others from the pain you've endured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.